Today, we're stepping into a deeply emotional story about courage, injustice, and the desire for change. It all begins with John Carter, a black veteran who left the battlefield in search of peace in his everyday life. However, during his usual morning jog at Greenwood Park, John witnesses an act of abuse of power targeting an innocent elderly woman. Rather than walking away, John decides to confront the two police officers, breaking the silence of the crowd and igniting the spark of justice. This brave act not only tests his courage but also sets off a dramatic chain of events that shakes the entire community. What could drive John Carter, a seemingly ordinary man, to become a symbol of resistance? Can he withstand the pressure from both the system and public opinion? Follow along as we uncover this gripping and heartfelt story. If you're drawn to lessons about justice and compassion, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. What would you do if you were in John's position? Share your thoughts in the comments below. John Carter, a retired veteran, jogged steadily along his familiar path in Greenwood Park. His shoes hit the pavement rhythmically, each breath steady, reflecting the life he had rebuilt after years of brutal combat. The worn leather bracelet on John's right wrist was a constant reminder of his military past. It was a keepsake from Mike, a close comrade who had fallen during a difficult mission in Afghanistan. John would never forget the day when warm blood ran down his arm as he pulled Mike out of the line of fire, promising to bring him home safely. But Mike never made it back. The bracelet was a symbol of that unfulfilled promise, and a reminder that John must always act with honor and courage. As his run brought him near the lake, his attention was drawn to a group of people ahead. Something was off. A sharp, threatening voice cut through the air. "Get up now, old lady. We've made ourselves clear." John slowed his pace, his eyes falling on two police officers confronting an elderly woman seated on a bench. The frail woman, her hair silver and her frame slight, trembled as she tried in vain to resist. "I told you, I didn't do anything wrong. Don't touch me," her voice cracked with fear. John felt his chest tighten. He had witnessed similar scenes before, where power was abused to oppress the vulnerable. But he had also told himself that he was no longer a soldier, that it wasn't his responsibility. Part of him wanted to turn away, but his legs refused to move. He stood there, watching from a distance, grappling with his own inner conflict. "If I don't do something, who will?" Blake, one of the officers, yanked the old woman roughly from the bench, causing her to lose her balance and fall to the ground. Her cry of pain pierced the air, drawing the attention of bystanders. John clenched his fists, his gaze igniting with suppressed anger. He strode quickly toward the scene, his voice low but commanding. "Stop right now." But this was just the beginning of a tense and challenging series of events. Would John's courage and the values he carried from his past be enough to face the storm that lay ahead? Don't miss the unfolding story, where conflicts will escalate and John's resolve will be put to the ultimate test. Share your thoughts in the comments and stay tuned for the next chapter. John Carter stepped forward, his tall frame shielding the frail elderly woman who had fallen to the ground. He looked sharply at the two police officers, his eyes cutting like knives. "Stop this right now. What do you think you're doing?" Blake turned, frowning at the man before him. "Who are you? This has nothing to do with you. Step away before I arrest you for obstructing police work." John's voice wasn't loud, but it carried undeniable authority. "Obstructing police work? Is that what you're calling abusing an elderly woman? Let her go, or you'll have to answer to this entire town." Carter, standing beside Blake, twirled the baton in his hand with a mocking tone. "Listen here, old man. You'd better get back to your jogging. We don't have time to play hero with you." John glanced at Mrs. Martha, her face pale and her eyes trembling with fear. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked under the weight of her terror. I was just resting on the bench. I didn't do anything. Please, I don't want any trouble." John crouched down, gently placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his gaze softening. "You don't need to be afraid. I'm here now." Blake, losing patience, stepped closer. "All right, listen up. Either you step aside or I'll have to use force. Trust me, you don't want that." John straightened, standing face to face with the two officers. "You don't want to try that. I've seen too many people misuse their authority, and I won't let it happen again." Blake, anger flaring, lunged forward, attempting to shove John out of the way. But he hadn't anticipated that the middle-aged man before him was far from ordinary. John moved swiftly, catching Blake's arm and locking it in a firm hold that rendered him immobile. Carter, seeing his partner restrained, rushed forward with his baton raised, aiming for John's shoulder. But John deftly dodged the attack and, with a quick twist, disarmed Carter in one fluid motion. The crowd surrounding them began to stir. Some cheered while others shouted loudly, "Stop this. This is abuse of power. We're recording everything." Blake struggled to free himself from John's grip, but John tightened the hold. "Don't try it again," he said, his tone low but commanding. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but you need to stop this now." Carter, now without his weapon, took a step back, his eyes flickering with uncertainty as the crowd continued to grow. He glanced at Blake, his expression laced with anxiety. "Blake, we need to stop. Everyone's recording this now." Blake turned his head and realized there were at least 10 phones pointed in their direction. Anger and embarrassment flashed across his face, but under the growing pressure of the crowd, he had no choice. "Fine, fine," he shouted. "Let me go." John released Blake, but kept his sharp gaze locked on the two officers. He bent down to help Mrs. Martha to her feet. "Are you okay, ma'am?" The elderly woman clung to John's arm, trembling. "Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to sit and rest. I didn't know this would happen." A young woman stepped forward from the crowd, her phone still raised. "They're abusing their power. He's protecting an innocent woman." "We all saw it," she said loudly. A middle-aged man nearby joined in, his voice booming with anger. "They have no right to do this. The police are supposed to protect people, not intimidate them." Blake turned to the crowd, trying to regain control. "All of you, step back now, or you'll be arrested for obstructing police work." But his threats no longer held any weight. The crowd erupted into louder protests, with many shouting, "Let her go now. We're not afraid of you." Carter moved closer to Blake and whispered urgently, "Blake, we need to leave. This is out of control." Blake clenched his teeth, his face contorted with fury. But he knew he was out of options. Before he could act, the distant wail of a police siren echoed through the park, signaling the arrival of reinforcements. A patrol car pulled up at the park entrance, and out stepped a middle-aged woman with a commanding presence, dressed sharply in a crisp uniform. It was Deputy Chief Sarah Taylor, known for her fairness and firm leadership. The crowd parted as she strode toward the scene. Sarah glanced at the two officers before turning her attention to John. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone calm but authoritative. Blake immediately pointed a finger at John, his voice filled with indignation. "This man obstructed our work and assaulted us." John didn't flinch. He met Sarah's gaze steadily and spoke firmly. "I intervened because they were abusing their power against an innocent elderly woman. There's video evidence everywhere. They used force without any justification." Sarah was silent for a moment, her eyes scanning each face, Blake's, Carter's, and finally Mrs. Martha's, who still clung to John, visibly shaken. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying undeniable authority. Blake hesitated, unable to respond. Carter kept his head down, avoiding Sarah's piercing gaze. "Uncuff the woman immediately," Sarah ordered, her voice sharp as a blade. "Both of you are suspended from duty, effective immediately. I'll deal with you later." Blake reluctantly obeyed, removing the handcuffs from Mrs. Martha's wrists. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their voices ringing out in support. John bent down, firmly taking the elderly woman's hand. "You're safe now. Let me take you home." Sarah approached John, her expression softening. "Thank you for stepping in and preventing this from escalating. However, I need you to come to the station to provide a statement. This situation needs to be properly addressed." John nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes to ensure justice is served." As John guided Mrs. Martha away from the scene, the crowd watched him with admiration. A woman shouted, "Mr. Carter, you're our hero," but John remained silent, walking steadily, aware that the real battle was still ahead. John's actions had ignited a flame within the community, but they also thrust him into the center of a powerful storm. Could he continue to stand firm under pressure from all sides? Stay tuned for the next chapter, where the truth begins to surface and tensions deepen. Share your thoughts and follow along for the gripping developments in John Carter's journey. The sound of the police siren faded into the distance as Deputy Chief Sarah Taylor left the scene, ensuring Mrs. Martha's safety. Blake and Carter, The two officers, temporarily suspended from duty, stood quietly in a corner, avoiding the furious gazes of the dispersing crowd. John Carter watched them leave, saying nothing, his cold and contemplative expression betraying the weight of his thoughts. The confrontation in the park was over, but he knew this was just the beginning of a larger battle, a fight against a deeply unjust system. As the crowd began to disperse, a few people approached John to show their support. A young woman, still holding up her phone to record, spoke quickly. "We captured everything. You're a hero, you know that. What you did today is going to spread everywhere." John shook his head slightly. "I'm no hero. I just did what was right." His eyes landed on a boy, about 10 years old, standing next to his mother. The boy gazed at John with wide, admiring eyes, as though he were the embodiment of courage. John smiled faintly, but a heavy feeling pressed against his heart. Will what I did today really change anything? He wondered. Within hours, videos of the Greenwood Park incident began to flood social media. Thousands of shares spread the hashtags Justice for Martha, Stop Police Abuse, and Hero John Carter. Footage of John skillfully restraining Blake and Carter while protecting Mrs. Martha became the center of attention. Comments poured in by the thousands. "This is what we need, people like John Carter. Abuse of power like this must be stopped. Hopefully the system will hold them accountable. Thank you, John. You've given us hope." The incident didn't just capture the attention of social media users, but quickly drew in local media outlets as well. Reporters from major news channels flocked to Greenwood Park, eager to get a statement from John. However, he declined every request. "I don't want to be the focus," he said firmly. "This isn't about me, it's about justice." Meanwhile, at the police station, Deputy Chief Sarah Taylor convened an emergency meeting with the leadership team. The atmosphere in the room was tense as Sarah played a video of the morning's events on a large screen. The officers watched in silence. Some looked visibly uneasy, while others frowned deeply. The weight of what they were witnessing hung heavily in the air. Sarah stepped forward, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "This is what we're dealing with. Two of our officers, Blake and Carter, blatantly abused their power. And this isn't the first time," his senior officer objected. "But, we can't let social media dictate how we handle every situation. Sometimes things aren't as they appear in these videos." Sarah turned, her tone firm and resolute. "It's not social media dictating our actions. It's their behavior that has destroyed the community's trust in us. If we don't address this seriously, who will believe in the police force anymore?" A heavy silence hung in the room. Finally, Sarah gave her orders: suspend Blake and Carter immediately. "I want a thorough internal investigation. And prepare to face the media. We will not cover up anything." Meanwhile, back at her home, Mrs. Martha remained shaken. A group of reporters knocked on her door, and after some hesitation, she agreed to share her story. Sitting on an old wooden chair, her face still bore traces of fear, but her voice was steady and determined. "In my whole life, I never thought I'd face something like this. I was just resting in the park, but they treated me like a criminal. If it weren't for John Carter, I don't know what would have happened. He stood up when no one else would." Her account moved millions when it aired on television. Messages of gratitude for John poured in from everywhere. However, Mrs. Martha emphasized, "This isn't just about me, it's about all of us. We cannot let injustice continue." That weekend, a community meeting was held at the local town hall. Hundreds attended, including John. He sat quietly at the back, not wanting to draw attention to himself. As the discussion began, angry voices filled the room. "We need to do something to stop this from happening again. They're abusing their power, and no one's doing anything about it." A middle-aged man stood up and pointed toward John. "Mr. Carter, you're the only one who had the courage to stand up. We need your help." John rose to his feet, looking around the room. Every eye was fixed on him. He took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm not a hero, and I don't have all the answers. But I do know this: we cannot stay silent. What I did was just an action in the moment, but all of you are the real strength. We have to come together to create change." The room erupted in applause. It was at that moment John realized, whether he wanted it or not, he had become a symbol for a movement demanding justice. News of the Greenwood Park incident continued to spread like wildfire. Media coverage was relentless, with articles and reports dissecting the abuse of power by the police force. Meanwhile, the local community grew increasingly divided, with one side rallying behind John Carter and calling for reform, while the other defended the police, claiming the incident had been exaggerated. At the police department, Deputy Chief Sarah Taylor personally oversaw the internal investigation into the actions of Officers Blake and Carter. In a private meeting room, Sarah confronted the two officers, her gaze heavy with disappointment. "What do you have to say about your actions at Greenwood Park?" Sarah asked, her tone cold and firm. Blake sat up straight, trying to maintain his composure. "We were following procedure, ma'am. The woman matched the description of a reported suspect, and that man, Mr. Carter, interfered with our work." Sarah cut him off, her eyes sharp as daggers. "What was the suspect description? An elderly woman sitting on a park bench. Is that why you felt justified in using force against a frail senior citizen?" Blake stammered, unable to find a defensible response. Carter, sitting beside him, remained completely silent, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Placing both hands on the table, Sarah leaned forward, her voice growing even more steely. "I've seen the video. The entire community has seen the video. Do you think you can hide what you did? This isn't just about your actions, it's about the community's trust in our force. I'm not only suspending you both, but also initiating a deeper investigation." Meanwhile, in the town's main square, hundreds of people gathered for a protest. They carried signs with slogans like "End Police Abuse" and "Justice for Mrs. Martha." Leading the protest was a coalition of local activists, including young advocates and respected community leaders. John Carter, however, did not join the protest. He sat by the window of his modest home, watching the procession of people passing by. His phone had been ringing nonstop since morning, with calls from journalists, activists, and even strangers who wanted to express their support. But John didn't answer. He didn't want to become the focal point of the movement. Though he remained out of the spotlight, John's actions continued to resonate throughout the community, sparking a collective demand for accountability and change. A knock at the door broke the silence. When John opened it, he saw Mrs. Martha standing there, a gentle smile on her aged face. "I know you want to stay away from all the commotion, but I couldn't let this go without thanking you. If it weren't for you that day, I don't know what would have happened to me." John invited her in and made a cup of tea. "You don't need to thank me. I just did what was right. But this isn't about you or me anymore. It's bigger than both of us." Mrs. Martha nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It is, and you're the one who started it. Don't let it end here." The growing public pressure forced the local government to make a statement. The town's mayor, a polished middle-aged man, addressed the press during a news conference. "We have all seen what transpired, and like you, I am deeply outraged. We are committed to a thorough investigation and implementing necessary reforms to ensure no one suffers from such abuse of power again." However, his words failed to appease the anger. Many residents felt they were empty promises. Meanwhile, Sarah Taylor worked tirelessly. She convened an independent investigation team, comprising human rights lawyers and external advisors. Reports began to pour in not only about the Greenwood Park incident, but also previous complaints against Blake and Carter. Complaints that had been ignored in the past now served as damning evidence against them. That evening, John sat at his desk, staring at the old leather bracelet on his wrist. Memories from the battlefield flooded back, moments when he had to make life and death decisions. But this time wasn't about war. It was about a different kind of fight, a fight against injustice. He picked up his phone and called a reporter who had been trying to reach him for days. When the call connected, John spoke slowly but firmly. "I'm ready to talk. Not about me, but about what needs to change." The interview aired the next day. During the program, John spoke little about himself. Instead, he focused on the need for systemic reform. What happened in the park wasn't an isolated incident. It's the result of a system that lacks accountability. If we don't fight back, incidents like this will continue. His words sparked an even stronger wave of support, drawing the attention of national human rights organizations. John was no longer just a witness, he had become a symbol of resistance, even though it was a role he had never sought. At the police department, the internal investigation uncovered shocking results. Sarah Taylor received a detailed report from the independent investigation team, which outlined a long list of complaints about the misconduct of officers Blake and Carter. Incidents that had previously been ignored or superficially addressed were now pieced together into a clear pattern. These two officers had repeatedly abused their power, particularly targeting people of color and the vulnerable in the community. Sarah convened a press conference to publicly disclose these findings for the first time. Standing at the podium, her gaze was firm and unyielding. "We have uncovered a series of serious violations involving Officers Blake and Carter. This is not just about the Greenwood Park incident, it's part of a systemic pattern of misconduct that has persisted for years. We are committed to not only holding the individuals accountable but also implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure this never happens again." News of Sarah's press conference spread quickly. National media outlets began to cover the Greenwood Park incident as a focal point, and numerous human rights organizations sent open letters demanding stronger action from the local government. Meanwhile, protests in the town grew larger, drawing participants from neighboring areas. John Carter, despite his reluctance to become the center of attention, continued to receive invitations to participate in discussions and forums. He knew that remaining silent at this point wouldn't help. After days of deliberation, he decided to attend a major community forum that would include local leaders and influential figures. In the town's large hall, hundreds of people gathered. The atmosphere was tense but filled with hope. When John stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause. Standing before the microphone, he scanned the room, taking in the expectant faces. "The first thing I want to say," John began, his voice deep and steady, "is that I am not a hero. I am not seeking attention or fame. I'm just an ordinary man who did what I thought was right in that moment." He paused, his gaze softening as he continued. "But what happened in the park is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger, deeper issue of systemic injustice where those meant to protect us abuse their power." A person in the audience stood up, their voice filled with emotion. "What should we do, Mr. Carter? We need to know how to bring about change." John nodded, his eyes reflecting a determined resolve. "We need to unite. First, we must ensure that those who abuse their power are held accountable. But it can't stop there. We need to address the root causes through education, training, and real reform. And most importantly, we cannot remain silent." The hall erupted in applause once more. John's words not only inspired those in attendance but also solidified his role as a leader in the movement, even though he had never sought that position. Meanwhile, at the police department, Blake and Carter were summoned to hear the official decision from the disciplinary committee. With a wealth of evidence presented, both were charged with serious abuse of power and violations of professional ethics. Sarah Taylor addressed the entire force, declaring, "Blake and Carter no longer represent this police department. They will face the law, and we must take responsibility for the failings in our system." Blake attempted to defend himself. "I was just doing my job. I can't control how people react," but his words fell into silence. No one in the room stood by him anymore. The Greenwood Park incident was no longer just a story of a small town. It became an inspiration for anti-abusive power movements in other places. Communities organized peaceful protests calling for police reform, spreading their message using the hashtag #JusticeForAll. John received hundreds of letters from across the country. One in particular, from a 12-year-old girl, moved him deeply. In the letter she wrote, "Thank you, Mr. Carter. You've given me hope that we can live in a fairer world." A month after the incident, the first reforms were implemented at the local police department: mandatory courses on professional ethics and cultural communication, along with the establishment of an independent oversight mechanism to handle complaints. Sarah Taylor was praised for her courage and determination, but she often said, "These changes are not the end. This is just the beginning." John returned to his daily life, but he knew he could never go back to the way things were. He participated in school discussions, encouraging young people to stand up against injustice and to build trust within their communities. On his morning jogs through Greenwood Park, he noticed more friendly faces and empathetic smiles. And on the bench where Mrs. Martha once sat, a small plaque had been installed, reading, "Justice is the strength of the community."